All right. Now, if you were here last year, there's going to be a good portion of this that will be familiar from last year, but I've added a few things, and I have to confess that some of what I've added, I did so with a little trepidation, um, because what I'm going to say about Satan, and I'm going to use the phrase the Satan with respect to the Old Testament, is probably going to be a lot different than what you've heard to this point. I'll telegraph it by saying this. I don't want to minimize Satan's power. And when I go through the Old Testament, the thought might pop into your head, well, doesn't he think there is a Satan? Like a big S Satan? Yes, I do. But the Old Testament does not know that guy. Okay? There is no capital S Satan in the Old Testament, meaning no grand cosmic enemy that's called Satan. There is a cosmic enemy. He's the serpent. Okay? We talked about him last time in the fall. But there are things like in the Old Testament, the serpent is never called Satan. Satan in Hebrew is never applied to the serpent in the Old Testament at all. And I'm going to show you a few things where Satan isn't even used as a proper noun in the Old Testament. What we think of as Satan as the word or the name for the great enemy of God is an idea that takes hold. There are linchpin ideas. There are thread beginnings in the Old Testament that, as you go through the intertestamental period and on into the New Testament, the term Satan becomes used as a term to describe the great enemy. But the Old Testament doesn't actually use that term to describe the great enemy. And there are some ramifications to that I think need to be put out there. Because on the one hand, the way the New Testament describes Satan, again, I don't want to minimize that. He is a liar. He is the accuser of the brethren. But in some respects, I think he gets portrayed as a little too big, or bigger than he really is. And I think this audience can appreciate that a little bit, because in the Old Testament idea of the unseen world does not include big S Satan. What the issue there are other beings, specifically that have cosmic geographical boundaries, and who are referred to as other gods and things like that. It's just a different perspective that gets elaborated upon and expanded in the New Testament. Well, I'll try to go through and make that clear. Some of this will be old hat for you, some of it will be new. Psalm 82 should be a passage that is familiar to everyone. But in case it's not, the screenshot here is the ESV. Psalm 82, verse 1, God has taken his place in the divine council. In the midst of the gods, he holds judgment. And you'll notice that the word God is in blue. There's a blue highlight on it. And below, where the columns are, right here, this column is also blue highlighted. That is showing you that this word, capital G-O-D, is the word Elohim in Hebrew. Here's what it looks like in Hebrew. Here's a transliteration. So the first word there is Elohim. We have a singular being because this is the verb right here. And if I were actually using the software, if I hovered over this, it would tell you that that's a singular verb. So I've often said on radio shows and on a website and all this stuff that Elohim is a term like fish or deer. If I say the word deer, D-E-E-R, how many? Yeah. There's no way to tell. I have to put it in a sentence. I have to attach it to a verb so that you know whether I mean one or more. If I say, the deer, let me think of a good verb that illustrates it. The deer is in the field. Singular. You know that because of the word is. The deer are in the field. It is obviously plural. Hebrew is the same way. You don't know if Elohim is singular or plural until you put it in a sentence. So you attach it to something else grammatically. And here the verb is singular. And so this Elohim has taken his place right here. Has to be singular. Well, now we have in the midst of the gods highlighted, and you'll see that it's the same word, Elohim. This one has to be plural because we have a prepositional phrase actually in Hebrew, in the midst of. That requires more than one. So that's why it's translated plural. So Psalm 82, verse 1 is a very useful verse. You have Elohim 2 times, same verse. One is singular, one is plural. And it's the God of Israel presiding over this thing called the divine council, this divine assembly. And the members of the assembly are called Elohim. Now, some, if this is the first exposure to this, sort of get freaked out by this. What do you mean there's more than one God? And, I thought there's only one, and blah, 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 blah. Well, let's talk about that. These Elohim have to be divine beings, plural, because in another passage, like Psalm 89, we have here, who among the heavenly beings is like the Lord, plural again. This is B'nai Elim. Elim is the plural of El. And they are in the skies. We go back to Psalm 82. Some will say, well, the gods here are humans. They're human judges. They're Israelite elders or something like that. There's a lot of, in my view, very strange explanations for this within the wider Christian evangelical orbit to deny that the gods in Psalm 82:1 are divine, non-human beings, because there's a fear that if we affirm that, we're somehow denying monotheism. Okay, but the difficulty again is you can't very well have a council of human Elohim in view in Psalm 82:1, because here the council, the assembly of the holy ones, is in the skies, and the beings are B'nai Elim. The last time I checked, human beings do not rule in the skies. Okay, they don't have a council somewhere up in the clouds. That's language that speaks of divine beings. And there's lots of other, reasons to include that. I said you are gods. Here again, we have a plural here because this in Hebrew is plural. The pronoun is plural. Sons of the Most High, again, sons is plural. All of you. Nevertheless, like men, you will die and fall like any prince. So what we have here is we have a scene where God is presiding over a bureaucracy, an administration, a council of other beings who are called Elohim as well. And he is their boss. He has power over them in terms of their mortality and immortality. And he's judging them. Psalm 82 is actually about the judgment of the corrupt administration of certain divine beings within the council. And that has eschatological ramifications we'll see on Sunday. That's actually part of Day of the Lord judgment. Now here's a list of passages where we have either Elohim or B'nai Elohim listed in them. I'm not going to go through all of them, but I just wanted to have some place where you have a sort of a neat little reference point for all of them. So it's not just one passage. Let's talk about this in relation to monotheism, because I want to get to what Elohim really means and how do we parse this. Incomparability of Yahweh. You have these statements that there's none besides me, none like me. These are not denials that other gods exist. How do I know that? Well, Deuteronomy 32:17 is probably a good passage. There, the gods, Elohim, are called Shadim, demons. Now, if you don't want to believe in the reality of other plural Elohim, you pretty much have to deny that demons exist as well. Because they're tied together in that passage. So right away you have a problem there. Well, then what do these statements like this mean? It just means that there's none like this one. There's something about Yahweh that is absolutely, authoritatively, exhaustively unique. Now, these denials, I think, interestingly, some of these denials occur in the same chapters, Deuteronomy 4, Deuteronomy 32, and then in the second half of Isaiah. They occur in chapters that elsewhere in the same chapter affirm the existence of other Elohim. Deuteronomy 32 is a really good one because Deuteronomy 32:17, they're called demons. Elsewhere in Deuteronomy 32, 8 and 9, we'll hit that. The sons of God are distributed among the nations, and the nations are allotted to the sons of God when Yahweh chooses Israel after the Babel event. The denial phrases are used elsewhere where denial of existence cannot be possible. It's a typo. Example, I have a whole list of them. Here are passages that use a variety of phrases to say something like, there's none beside me, there's none like me, there's no God except me, and all this kind of stuff. These are the Hebrew phrases, if you can read Hebrew. But I want to zero in on these two. Isaiah 47, 8 and 10, and Zephaniah 2:15. In both of those instances, those verses use what we would refer to as a denial phrase of Babylon, where Babylon, the city, is personified and says, there's none beside me, there's no other. So, is that a claim that there are no other cities that exist in the world other than Babylon? Well, that would be absurd because, hey, there's lots of cities. Babylon, attacks them all the time. It's a statement that I'm the best. I am superior. And I'm suggesting that that's what these mean. That's the way that you parse incomparability statements or denial statements with the fact that some of the same chapters tell you there are other Elohim. Now, what gets called an Elohim? If you actually study the Old Testament and do a search for Elohim, and I don't really recommend doing it because it just takes so long. It occurs thousands of times in the Old Testament. But you will find out that 6 things get referred to as Elohim. Now that alone should tell you that an Israelite knew that the word Elohim was not a word that exclusively applied to a set of attributes. The very fact that a monotheistic Israelite could call something else Elohim while he refers to his God as Elohim should tell you immediately there's something going on with that word. Because if the point of all those denial statements was to say that no other Elohim exist, and Elohim only speaks of capital G-O-D, why in the world are biblical writers using the term of gods in this council, gods of the nations like Ashtoreth? Interestingly enough, the masculine is used instead of the feminine. There is no biblical Hebrew word for goddess. They don't use it. They use the masculine form of the word. Just kind of interesting. Milcom, the Elohim of the Ammonites. Demons, Deuteronomy 32:17. Disembodied human dead are called Elohim. This is the Samuel incident where Saul goes to the medium, the mistress of the Ov at Endor, and says, hey, I'd like to talk to Samuel. And yeah, call him up. And, whatever she does, she gets Samuel, and it kind of freaks her out because, she just sort of goes to pieces. And Saul says, well, what do you see? And she says, I see Elohim coming up from the ground. And then he says, what does he look like? Okay, singular, what does he look like? And she describes Samuel, and then Samuel says, why are you disturbing me? You're going to die. Forget anything you're going to ask for. The answer is no. Because Saul wants some pity, and he ain't getting it. He's doomed. But nevertheless, Elohim used of the human dead there, and angels This is a reference here. Genesis 35:7 uses a plural that refers to the gods, plural, that appeared to Jacob at Bethel. If you go back to Bethel, you find out that that's the place where Jacob wrestled with a man who turns out to not be a man. And other passages, allow you to draw the conclusion this is the angel of the Lord. So that person is included in Elohim language as well. So what do we do with this term? This tells you it's not a denial of monotheism. It's a word that a biblical writer could use of 5 different things besides the God of Israel. Now, it's hard for us because we use God, and we mentally attach to it a specific set of attributes that are only relevant to the God of Israel. And so when a lot of people, when you tell them for the first time, hey, the Bible says there are other Elohim, it freaks them out because they think you're saying there are other beings like Yahweh, when that isn't what the biblical writers were saying. Elohim is what I like to call a place of residence term. If you are called Elohim, it means you are someone or something that belongs in the disembodied spiritual realm. Gods of the council, demons, disembodied dead, angels, and of course, Yahweh, the God of Israel, and the Israelite Godhead. All of these things are Elohim, and all that it does, all the term does, is tell you where this being properly resides. That's it. Now, in that realm, there's hierarchy, there's differentiation of attributes. Yahweh is an Elohim, but no other Elohim are Yahweh. He is unique. He's what I call species unique. This is what an Israelite believed. It didn't matter that there were other Elohim running around. What mattered was there was only one of those, like by definition. In fact, this one created all the other ones. They are derivative. They are contingent. They are inferior. But they all live at the same place, and that place is the spirit world, the unseen world, the spiritual world. That's all the term means. I want to hit some other terminology, because that was sort of review. Park a little bit here. Shadim is actually a very rare term in the Old Testament. It is used only 2 places. Right there, do your exhaustive word study on Shadim, demons, 2 passages. It tells you right away that demonic, what we would call a demonic entity, plays a very small role in the Old Testament theology of the unseen world. The more significant characters are the sons of God who are corrupt, who are the administrators of the nations. They're a big deal. The other big deal are the spirits, the Rephaim spirits who inhabit Sheol, who inhabit the underworld. They're a big deal. Demons, not so much. They're minor players. As best as can be told, this is probably a word that comes from Akkadian, Shadu, it would still be a singular, which refers to a spirit being or some kind of force. All right? It's nearly always singular in Babylonian Akkadian literature. When it's singular, it can be a good thing, okay, a protective spirit. When it's plural, it's always bad, and it's only plural in the Old Testament. So you have a high degree of agreement right here, again, cross-culturally, that when the term is used as a plural, and by the way, the New Testament takes this pattern too, the plurality is deliberate, and it has a sinister tone to it. When you get a pluralization like this, it telegraphs to everyone in the Semitic world that the Shadim referred to here are not good. They're bad. But you only have 2 occurrences of it. But nevertheless, they're sinister, bad guys. Cherubim, both cherubim and seraphim are really the same thing, but the terms are the terms derived from different cultural images. Let's put it that way. A cherubim, it comes from Akkadian koribu or karuv, and it was a reference to a creaturely entity that guards the throne. We've all seen like these pictures of the winged bull kind of critters. Okay, it's that sort of thing. This word again comes from Akkadian. Seraphim is from the Egyptian seraph, which is a fiery serpent, and in Egyptian culture they were the throne guardians. So it's really the same sort of function, but the terms are different, but it's sort of the same level, the same office, that kind of thing. A couple illustrations. This one is not. This one actually comes from Phoenician, so this is a more Canaanite illustration. This would be a koribu or karuv, right here. Again, always associated with the throne guardianship. This is just a selection from an Akkadian lexicon. Another picture. This one is actually something very similar, just hand drawn, and you get the idea. Creaturely, human face, but creaturely body. Angels, when they are described in the Old Testament, are always human in appearance. These are not. Here's an illustration of the seraph, or seraphim is plural. The Egyptian flavor, again, a winged serpent figure, human face. But where we see this is typically Isaiah 6. Now, some think that seraph comes from the Hebrew seraph, to burn. Seraph is actually a noun, though, for snake. And again, in the Egyptian cultural context, it's a throne guardian. Now, I have this note here. Isaiah's time, Isaiah 6 is where we get the seraphim reference. In Isaiah's time, Israelite kings used a lot of Egyptian iconography, a lot of Egyptian symbols and portrayals in their own architecture, their own royal trappings, which is why Isaiah, because he's living and ministering in this time where the kings use things with Egyptian flavoring, this is why he chooses the word seraph or seraphim instead of karuv or cherubim. And as an example, this is King Hezekiah's seal. It's the actual seal. This is the hand drawing. And at the top, this says Yehuda, so Judah. And this is Lechezkiyahu, belonging to Hezekiah, gotta tilt my head here. Ahimelech. You have belonging to Hezekiah, the brother of, or let's see, is this a Z? Yeah, that's a Z. Achaz Melech, belonging to Hezekiah of Achaz the king. Hezekiah, whose father was Ahaz, the king. So this is Old Hebrew script. But if you look at it, it's the Kepher beetle. It's a completely Egyptian symbol. And the Kepher beetle, with the wings, was a symbol of life. I was chatting with somebody in between one of the breaks. The reason that the Kepher beetle, the dung beetle, is a symbol of life to the Egyptians is these beetles would roll these little balls of dung around with their hind legs. Go to YouTube, you'll see a video of it. It's hilarious. They're rolling these little balls of dung around, and the Egyptians happened to notice that sometimes these little balls of dung, little beetles come out of them. I mean, they didn't know that what was going on was the beetle was laying the eggs, and after a while they would incubate and then they were born. The Egyptians thought that the beetle had power to create life, like spontaneous generation. And so it became a symbol of life, creation, creative power. And it was a familiar symbol of life and prosperity. So Hezekiah takes it as his own. This 8 Hasatan in the Old Testament. Again, some of this is probably going to be pretty new, but I want to show you this, and maybe you can. I would be interested to, when we get done with this, at some point while I'm here, it'd be interesting to hear how some of this is processed on your end. This noun, Satan, occurs 27 times in the Old Testament. What I did was I ran a search in my software, 27 results in 23 verses. Okay, you can see that there. Now, the Hebrew word Satan is not a proper noun in the Old Testament. That is because of Hebrew grammar. Let me go back here. We'll use the next one. As with English, Hebrew does not append what's called the definite article to a proper personal noun. The definite article is the word the. I don't refer to myself as the Mike. That just sounds stupid. We don't put the word the in front of a proper personal name. Hebrew doesn't either. And in nearly every instance of the occurrence of this word, the definite article is attached to it. It cannot be a proper name by rules of Hebrew grammar. It never does it. So, this is just a quote from a grammar, so you know I'm not making it up. This is from Walton O'Connor's Biblical Hebrew Syntax. You skip that. I ran a search on the word Satan with the definite article in front of it. So again, you can see I'm just not making it up. Here are the results. You'll notice that all of your occurrences in Zechariah and Job have the definite article. If Job 1, 6-9, 12, 2, 1-4, so on and so forth, they all have the definite article. This is not a proper name in Job 1 and 2, or Zechariah 3. Satan actually is an office in the divine council. The job of the Satan is actually described in Job 1 and 2. Have you considered my servant Job? And he asked the Satan, where have you been? What does he answer? I've been running around to and fro throughout the earth. The Satan, his job was to go see who was in obedience to God and who wasn't. Because if you weren't, then you were in trouble. You were unrighteous. If you died unrighteous, you were going to go to Sheol and all that kind of stuff. Stay. There are 3 instances where the noun does not have the definite article. So here there's a possibility. We could have a proper personal name. They are Numbers 22, verses 22 and 32, and 1 Chronicles 21:1. Again, we might have proper name here. However, if you look them up, the context denies that idea in all 3. Right here, these 2 of them, guess who's called Satan? The angel of the Lord. He is not a bad guy. He is not a cosmic enemy. He is, in fact, the embodied Yahweh. Satan means to oppose, means to be an adversary, to be an accuser, a challenger. So when the Satan was running around, checking up on people who were in obedience or disobedience, he would say, yeah, I saw Jeff over there, and Jeff, just that and the other thing, and you need to, Lord, you need to do something about that situation. So when he shows up in Job, God says, do you have anything to report about Job? Knowing what the answer is going to be. Now, where the Satan goes wrong in Job 1 and 2 is he challenges God. He says, yeah, I know about Job. He's a righteous man, but that's only because he has a nice life. I'll bet if you did this, that, and the other thing to it, he would curse you. And the Lord says, you're wrong. And then, the whole rest of the book ensues where you find out that he was wrong. And, it opens the whole thing about why did God let this happen and so on and so forth. At the end, the real answer to that is because Job needed to trust that the decision that God made had nothing to do with Job's character. He was blameless. God said he was blameless, so I think he was blameless. God would know if he wasn't. And Job suffers because for some reason, God deemed that acceptable for some other end. And the problem with the book of Job is you're really not told what the end is. Now, Job gets restored, and he's rewarded, for not cursing God, but he's also a little rebuked in the end because, Job naturally wanted to know why, but he didn't come to the right conclusion. The why is because I'm God and you're not. I have my reasons. You need to trust me that just as I am as good and as wise as I am powerful and allowing you to go through this suffering, you have to believe that. That's your answer. I'm not going to give you any more detail than that. I want you to be faithful, Job, and I'm going to restore you. We get a little frustrated with that, but Job had to accept that, and he had to do what? He had to believe. That's a hard lesson. It's hard to believe. Yeah. In cases like that. The other example here, 1 Chronicles 21:1. This is when Satan prompts David to take a census, and then God punishes him for it. If you go to the parallel passage, who does the prompting? Go ahead and look it up. Or maybe I have it here. 2 Samuel 24:1. Who prompts David to take the census?
Joab?
No.
Listen to God, I think.
What?
The Lord.
The Lord. Yahweh. The way you reconcile that is there are things about the description of the Satan here that describe the angel of the Lord in other passages. That is how you reconcile the passages, because both the angel of the Lord and the Lord are the Lord in Old Testament theology. They're both Yahweh. So there is no contradiction. But if you deny that, then you have Satan doing one thing, proper name Satan, versus Yahweh. And you get in all sorts of trouble there. Well, I guess Yahweh is Satan then, and Satan is Yahweh. No, you're missing the whole point. But, you'll see that sort of discussion in certain things. So even in this, and by the way, Yahweh prompting David to do this and then punishing him for it, the narrative says that God had already had an occasion. David was under judgment. And so when God prompts this, he is going to use David's census as the means to punish him, for, a bigger picture sort of thing. So sometimes, the lesson is, sometimes God can put you in a situation as a stepping stone to chastisement. This is what he does with David. It's God's prerogative to do that. God is the judge. God is our judge. He's all our judge. He's our boss. And sometimes God needs to chasten us. And if God is watching over our lives, sometimes he'll say, you go over there, because I know when you go over there, you're going to get your butt kicked. And you're going to learn something through that experience. And you need to go through that experience. Okay. Again, it's sort of a Job scenario. You have to trust me that this chastisement is going to work together, for your own good somewhere down the road. And with David, as bad as it was, it has the desired effect. If you don't have God, does that mean 5 minutes?
No, it means I have a question.
Sure.
How do you reconcile the New Testament that says God doesn't tempt? do the tempting, and yet it sounds like God
because
is tempting
it wasn't,
David.
he's not tempting him to do a moral, like a moral evil or
Okay.
something like a crime or something like that. He tempts him to do something unwise and that leads to suffering. You know, it sometimes God gets directly involved in the chastisement for our sin is the overall lesson.
Okay.
There are a few other occasions like this where God steps in, with other biblical characters to be sort of a direct instrument, of their chastisement. But it's never like final annihilation or anything like that. I mean, it's chastisement.
Mm-hmm.
David is still the man after God's own heart. God still makes a covenant with him. He still has Solomon. He doesn't take the kingship away. All that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But nevertheless, Joab comes in and says, "This is just a dumb idea. Why are you doing this?"
Yeah.
And Joab doesn't want to do it. He thinks it's a needless prelude to war. The verbs that are used there are used for mustering troops, the census. If you go back, like in the book of Numbers, it's the same terminology used there to assemble troops. And Joab's saying, we don't need to go to battle anywhere. What are you doing? Because he's the captain of the army. He's going to have to go do the dirty work. And he's like, this is just not, this is dumb. This is a bad idea. But David is lifted up in pride. Either wants to go gain something militarily or just know how big his army is or whatever it is. But God uses that, to punish him, for what's in his heart.
Mm-hmm.
But sometimes that happens.
Could David have resisted? Could he have not done it?
I think in this instance, it's pretty clear. I would say in this instance that the answer is no, because God directly steps into the situation and wants that to happen in that way for David. I think God is very free to step in and make something happen. I mean, like a direct intervention, so that there's a concatenation of events. I don't think there's any biblical justification for thinking that every event that happens, like how many spoonfuls it took me to finish off my bowl of soup today was, predestined, and the amount of time it took me to do that. And that's a lot different, than saying God can intervene here. I think with Saul, Paul, I think God says, I'm going to get that guy. And I'm going to get him today. And I'm going to get him right now. I'm going to knock him off his horse. I'm going to show up to him. He's going to believe in me because, what else is he going to do?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, how is he going to resist this? And then when he gets off his feet, I'm going to tell him, you go to the town, and I'm going to tell you what to do. And then things start rolling from then on out. So I think God is perfectly free to do that. I just don't think that there's any biblical merit that every event that occurs in every place of every time works that way.
Mm-hmm.
So as a summary, you have here Elohim is used for beings in the unseen world for a whole host of things. It's basically synonymous with spirit, like a spiritual being, a being that resides in the spirit world. You have other terms: Satan, Malachim, messenger, angel, sons of God, cherubim, seraphim. Shadim might denote disposition because in the plural, I mean, in Akkadian, there's like hundreds of these, and it's always a malevolent being when it's in the plural. So some scholars would say the word itself might denote malevolence, just a malevolent entity. Proper names, again, some of them, you do have proper names: Baal, Yahweh. Some of them have meanings. But they all have meanings, but sometimes the meanings are more significant or have more impact in terms of a scene or a specific role. Terms are of appearance or character: Nacash, again, serpent or serpentine. It has other meanings, as we talked about last year. I'm not going to go through the whole thing about. Nacash can mean one who practices divination, with the intent to deceive. Okay, there's a verb Nacash for that. Nacash can mean shining one, because the article is appended to this as well, the Nacash. If this is the adjective, it means the shining one. Again, it would denote something about character or appearance. Stars, Tsebaot, heavenly host. So you have a fairly limited range of beings for the unseen world. Most of what occurs outside these are specific proper names of deities, of entities. Chemosh, Milcom, something like that. Obviously foreign deities. In terms of structure, you have Yahweh at the top. This is the sort of the bureaucratic council structure. Sons of God and Malachim. So sons of God is hierarchically significant because it's the sons of God who have geographical rule. They run the nations. They are in charge of the other nations besides Israel. It's a higher pay grade. Okay, we want to use it that way. Then these guys down here, they're all Elohim. They're all Elohim because they live in the spiritual world. Yahweh, of course, is the sovereign. Sons of God rule the nations, also referred to as princes in Daniel 10. And the Malachim, the term just means messenger. Okay, they communicate in some way with usually people. Who's absent? Elohim and Sheol never show up in any council passage, either in the Bible or outside. Like in the text of Ugarit, you never see them in a council structure. Demons, again, are not ever in any sort of job structure, which is why a lot of scholars again think it refers to disposition, a malevolent being. Rephaim are in Sheol, but again, the Rephaim, if you're down here, I mean, this isn't the council structure, but Sheol, the underworld, the place of the dead, the realm of the dead, is something that, obviously God has ultimate control over because he's God. But in terms of running the affairs of the terrestrial world, interaction with humans in a bureaucratic way, you don't have them depicted or described in that sort of council-like bureaucratic setting. Now, in their own realm, and the dead go there, in their own realm, I think that there is hierarchy implied because the Nacash is sent. Part of his punishment, part of the curse, is that he is put down to Eretz, which is typically translated to ground, but that is also a word used for the underworld. Okay, it's used in Job that way. It's used in a couple other places. Jonah. So he is like the original. The Nacash is like the original inhabitant, and by definition, the overlord of this realm, the realm of the dead. And that is his chief point of power over humanity. This is a point I want you to realize. The Nacash, the great cosmic enemy, the power that he has over humanity is the fact that they die. Yahweh can remove you. If you're a believer, you're again the godly, the hope of the Old Testament person, everybody goes to Sheol, everybody dies. Sheol is both the grave, and it was viewed as you get put in the ground and then you just kind of keep going down there and you wind up in the underworld. But the hope is that the righteous will be pulled out of there by the Lord to be with him. We think the same way even as believers. When I die, I go to the other world, I go to the afterlife, the spiritual world, I pass over. Modern humans use this kind of language too. And the hope of the believer is that when I pass over, in that realm, in the realm of the afterlife, there's an awful part of it, and there's a wonderful part of it. There's with the Lord and not with the Lord. We're just sort of trapped by having to use the language of geography, the language of place, like it has latitude and longitude when it doesn't. But you pass over to the next life, and the next life is either one of damnation or one with the Lord. they're expressing the same thing. And if you wind up in Sheol, only the Lord can take you out, and He only will if you were godly, if you believed in Yahweh, and you weren't disloyal, all that kind of stuff. Just the Old Testament theology there. But in the bad part, not only are the unrighteous human dead there forever to remain, but Rephaim are there. Rephaim outside the Bible are depicted as the departed spirits of the great kings, the great warrior kings of old, the great Gibborim, right, of old. Now, in Canaanite texts, they are not called giants, but the idea of Gibborim and Rephaim are used in the Old Testament of both great warrior kings, Genesis 6:4, you have Gibborim there, and also giants. So it's a good bet that this is sort of an Old Testament. This is where the idea of the association, just like it says later in the Second Temple period, when you kill the Nephilim, the immaterial part of the dead Nephilim became a demon. In Jewish theology, that's where demons come from. We're never told where Shadim come from, malevolent spirits, in the Old Testament. They're just there. They're not there much, but they're just there. But in Jewish texts between the Old and New Testament, they spent a lot of time here. And the view there is that when God wanted the Nephilim destroyed, when one of them died, their spirit went to the underworld, okay, and became part of that, became a malevolent spirit. Now, they're not locked in. They can come and go. There's only a place of, a special place in hell, okay, for certain of these, the offending sons of God, okay, in Genesis 6, are always across the board. Whether in the New Testament, the references to being in chains, okay, Tartarus, and intertestamental Jewish literature like in Enoch, the original offenders are locked away. All the other inhabitants, malevolent spiritual inhabitants of Sheol, or the underworld, are not locked away. They come and go. When you die, that's who you run into, if you're left there. Okay? And they're never part of any sort of life on earth administrative structure. But in their own realm, you have to coexist with them. And they were feared. I mean, even outside the biblical text, it was a fearful thing to go to the underworld and encounter one of these. Okay, that's even outside of biblical theology. What was that? No, but I mean, when you die and you end up there, it was a fearful thing. Now the Nacash, again, is demoted to the underworld, taking Eretz as underworld. Here's a couple passages. This one's interesting. Ezekiel 26 actually mentions Rephaim as well, and uses Eretz to describe the realm of the Rephaim. And you'll never see the word Satan used in association with Sheol either. You will see Nacash. This is his realm. This is his domain. This is where he's sentenced. Great enemy. He is the Lord of the dead. He is the Lord of this place. And since everyone dies, I mean, think of it this way, everyone dies, and so he has dominion over all humans, unless they are believers and they are transferred from his realm to the Lord's. Otherwise, he has complete dominion.
Is the Nacash Satan, Lucifer, and we in the
Yes. I mean, later on in the New Testament, this term, in terms of a challenger, of an adversary, is applied to serpent. And another term is brought into this. Again, getting back to the realm of authority here, once the resurrection happens, think about this. Once the resurrection happens, again, had they known, they would have never crucified him. Once the resurrection happens, there is no claim okay, on anyone who is in Christ. You don't even go there for like a minute. Okay, you don't even touch the place. And it doesn't matter whatever accusation, there's the Satan element, whatever the Nacash or one of his underlings says, whatever charge they bring against the believer is completely irrelevant. Because they are in Christ, and when they die, they are out of there. There is no claim at all. He has no legal status. I think of Satan as a prosecutor without a perp. He's got nobody to accuse. Now, he's going to act like he does, but he's got nobody to accuse. It's like, what are you doing here by yourself in court? Just get out of here. I mean, there is no claim. This is why the first coming, okay, the resurrection, and the crucifixion and the resurrection, we're going to talk a lot about how the first coming, the kingdom is inaugurated. That is sort of that's the beginning of the end, and it's triggered by the crucifixion, because with this, you're rolling back people. Every person who becomes a believer is one taken away. The claim to another person is over. And it's because of the resurrection, it's because of belief in the resurrection, in the work of Christ. So the resurrection is the key to rolling this away. It's the key to reclaiming the nations from these guys as the kingdom advances. Every foot of kingdom turf, that a believer occupies is 1 foot less that they occupy. Again, you have to think of these rollback, kind of metaphors, these terms. It's all triggered by the resurrection. So it is the fundamental event. It's the key event. But this is sort of its own territory. In terms of people who are living, this guy can accuse believers all he wants. You just don't belong here anymore. Go back home. You go back home and preside over the ones that are yours because they're dead. Okay, because of the fall. You started this. They are mortal now. They will die. And if they don't, believe in the revelation that Yahweh gave them, all the way up through the cross and all that kind of stuff, then because of the fall, because of, losing immortality, and because they made the decision not to believe, you own them. They're yours, but they're the only ones you have any claim over. You think you have claim over everybody because they're mortal, because everybody dies. No, you don't. No, you don't. That's why Jesus is called the first fruits, okay, from the dead. I mean, that event triggers all the other ones. It's the basis for any resurrected person, Old or New Testament, being with the Lord. It's the basis for that. Go ahead.
This may be a little rabbit trail, but what do you think was going on with after the resurrection? And it says that holy people came out of the grave and showed themselves in the city and that sort of thing.
Repeat the question. Mike.
Okay. He asked, what do I think about the accounts? I think it's in Matthew, where people were resurrected after the resurrection of Christ.
And they talked with
Right.
people.
I think the purpose behind that was the same purpose as Jesus going around healing people and casting out demons. In other words, I'm giving you a taste of what the kingdom will be like. In other words, these are little object lessons. I'm here. I'm going to start the kingdom now. When the kingdom reaches its full consummation, there is no more death. There is no more sickness. I mean, just fill in the list with the stuff Jesus does. This is what it's going to be like. And it includes the resurrection of the dead. The dead will come back to life. So I think that was a foretaste in that area, like the others were foretastes in the other areas.
Is there any indication that has to happen at some like it just like a switch is flipped and all of a sudden the kingdom comes, or is that like a process that's already in place that's happening
It's a process that's already in place that is inexorable. When Jesus said, upon this rock I will build my church. We'll talk a little bit about where he was standing when he said that. It has nothing to do with Peter. It has nothing to do with the Protestant view that God being the rock, and it has nothing to do with any of that. It has to do with where they're at. They're at the gates of hell when he says that. But what was recognized as the gates of hell. And what he's saying there is this, what I'm doing here is going to start a ball rolling that will never be stopped. The gates of hell, our translations say will not prevail against it. Well, the problem with that translation is the word against does not show up in the Greek text. It should be translated, the gates of hell will not withstand it. The verb is passive. Okay? There's no object to it. The church is not on the defensive.
Mm-hmm.
The church is on the offensive. And the gates of hell will not be able to withstand it. This kingdom, if you think about Daniel, we're going to get into prophecy. The last kingdom, during the last earthly kingdom that Daniel talks about, that is the point when the kingdom of God, the kingdom not made with human hands, begins. And it's a kingdom that has no end. When did that happen? That happened at the first coming. Because that's the last kingdom. Okay? And it depends on what you view. Some say the fourth kingdom is the Hellenistic Seleucid period, the intertestamental period. The kingdom starts there and keeps on rolling. A lot of people say it's Rome, okay, during the time when Jesus was there. I don't really care what view you take. It's just, I kind of like the Rome one because Jesus is present. But once that kingdom begins, it has no end. It keeps progressing. And the final consummation, I believe, will be on earth. Even though I don't like the term millennium. I think the millennium is too small. Okay, if that makes any sense. And hopefully it will later. But Eden was on earth, as it was in the beginning, so it will be at the end. I mean, there's just a point to all these things. There needs to be closure on the planet, the reclamation of the nations, all that kind of stuff. I believe in an earthly kingdom for a lot of different reasons than your classic sort of millennial arguments. And some of those arguments are really bad. Some of them are okay. I think most of them are just irrelevant. I just look at it a different way. And when you have these sort of reversal mechanisms and you know where it's moving back toward, it's an inevitable, inexorable process that's already begun. I think if there's one big lesson I'd like to communicate during the time that we spend here, it's that a lot of the really cool stuff in terms of the power of the kingdom, the presence and all this kind of stuff, you don't have to wait for that.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not like in this remote future thing. It began, a couple thousand years ago. And again, it's this inexorable process. It's a spiritual battle. It's a war. It's all these things. But I think some people just have the idea that, wow, the real victory is going to happen. The final victory is going to happen out there. But there's no reason to suspect that substantial victories can't happen now because of all this other stuff. That's the whole purpose. It's the whole intent.
Mike, I have a question before you go off this slide. And for just for my frame of reference, help me out here. We've talked about the Nacash, but bring in Isaiah 14, Lucifer, something, the main hell. Just put it in this model that you have.
Okay. We have Genesis 3. This is the term that's used in Genesis 3 of the serpent. The serpent's curse is, again, to be cast down to the ground and crawl on your belly and all that kind of stuff. The serpent winds up, instead of being above everything, the guy in charge, he's essentially the guy under everybody's feet. Now, and Eretz can refer to terra firma, but Eretz is really the underworld because that's his domain, Allah, Isaiah 14. Isaiah 14, you have the same backdrop story. Isaiah 14 and Ezekiel 28 are instances where the prophets are respectively railing against one's the king of Babylon, the other's the king of Tyre, and in their rant, the prophetic rant against these kings, the prophets use a backdrop story of a divine being who was swelled up with pride, like the king is proud, swelled up with pride and was punished. He wanted to be above the stars of God. That's Isaiah 14. I will be like the Most High. I will be above the stars of God. I will, have rule over the council. I will, sit on the Mount of Assembly, the Har Moed, and all this kind of stuff. No, you won't. His judgment is to be sent down to the earth, to the ground, to the Eretz, to Sheol. I mean, this is where he gets sent. So the names, the characters, in Isaiah 14, the person is called Helel ben Shachar, which is the shining one, the son of the dawn, which is why I think it's important to recognize that Nacash can refer to a shining being. Ezekiel 28, it's Karuv, and also described in terms of brilliant, jewel-like appearance. Again, shininess, that kind of thing. So you have three uses. One in Genesis is sort of describing the primeval event, but the other two are utilizing elements of the story to get across the point of how hubris is punished, and God brings him down to this realm. So it's not just Nacash. Hillel, this is Hillel, and this is the anointed prince, the cherub of Ezekiel 28, all describing the same demotion, the same punishment, and the person is cast out of Eden. Ezekiel 28, has him cast out of Eden, the garden of God, the mountain of God, that kind of thing. So you have sort of three versions of the same event, but two of them are used for different purposes. Go ahead.
Does Satan and Nacash, or these other sons of God who are in rebellion, do they still have access to the divine council room now?
Yeah,
I repeat the question.
does Satan still have access to the divine council room? I would like to wait on that because I made that a part of a New Testament thing. The passage in Luke where Jesus says, "I saw Satan fall like lightning, from heaven," and stuff, something like that. So, can I wait for that? Just get permission here. Again, human dead are in Sheol. We've already hit that. Again, Nacash, we've already hit the absence of this term in the Old Testament. In the New Testament, this term is applied to the Nacash. And also earlier in the Second Temple period, there is sort of a more intense focus on the serpent and using other terms, including Satan, Satan, of that being. And we've covered that before. From Nacash to Satan, let me say a little bit more about this. Again, the Old Testament role of this divine being was, it's just a term that to say Hasatan.
Yeah, it's still moving.
Okay, Deuteronomy 32, 8, and 9. Again, just
I'll call brands.
we spent a lot of time on this last year. I wanted to, again, just refresh this in your memory. Again, that middle tier of the council, the whole, sons of God, the princes over the nations, and that sort of thing. The middle tier in the council hierarchy appears to be occupied again by Elohim, whose role it has something to do with cosmic geography, with administration of the nations that were disinherited by Yahweh, and that idea comes from this passage. So what you're looking at here is I have the NIV at the top in case you've never seen this before. 32, 8, and 9. NIV is here, and it says, when the Most High gave the nations their inheritance, when he divided all mankind, he set up boundaries for the peoples according to the number of the sons of Israel. And down here in the ESV, it says, according to the number of the sons of God. Sons of God is the correct reading. It's the reading of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Basically, there's really no versional evidence that supports sons of Israel, but the better argument, since we're not going to sit here and do textual criticism, the better argument is that when does this happen? When does the Most High divide up the nations and all that stuff? In the Old Testament story, that happens
Babel.
at Babel. Yeah. Was there an Israel in existence at the time of Babel?
No.
No, there wasn't. So this is, again, in terms of the biblical story and logic, and of course the textual evidence, it should not say sons of Israel. The correct reading is sons of God. So what you have happening is the Deuteronomy 32 looks back at what happens at Babel and essentially says, at that time, God decided, I'm not going to be like working with every nation. I'm not going to be on a one-to-one basis with humankind. I gave you instructions after the flood, and you're still disobeying me, and blah, 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 blah. God disinherits humanity, okay, as his own. He said, fine, you want to do your own thing? I'm not going to be, I'm going to sort of wash my hands of you, and I'm going to give you your wish. Okay, you're not going to have to listen to me anymore. And instead, this is the Old Testament explanation or rationale, ultimately, for where other pantheons come from. God puts the nations under the authority of lesser divine beings. He charges them with the administration of the nations. We learn from Psalm 82 that they do a crummy job. Because they're judged in Psalm 82 for being corrupt. The sons of God over the nations, they're not doing what they should be doing. I mean, God's not totally, wanting everybody else in the world, to go to hell in a handbasket. He's just not going, they're not going to be his people. In verse 9, God makes a decision. The Lord's portion is his people. Jacob is his allotted heritage. It's at this time, right on the heels of Babel, that God calls Abram. So I'm going to take you, one guy, and I'm going to make my own nation. We're going to start over. We're going to start from scratch. Now, he tells Abram at the time, that it's through you that all other nations of the earth will be blessed. Okay? So God has a plan for dealing with the nations he's disinherited. It's just that they're not going to be in the one-to-one intimate relationship with him. He is going to start his kingdom program over with a specially chosen nation. They're supposed to be the object lesson. They're supposed to be the conduit through whom and to which the truth about the true God is supposed to flow. Israel does a miserable job of that. They can barely, in fact, they don't even handle their own affairs as far as their own loyalty to Yahweh. But the kingdom, again, kingdom rule, which is God's desire, is going to begin anew, not with everybody, but with one nation. We're going to do something with that nation that, when it's in place, is going to go back and bring the other nations into it. Deuteronomy 32, you don't have really a view of what that looks like. The rest of the Old Testament is Israel against the other nations and Yahweh against the other gods and all this sort of thing. And so it begins to sort of play out in both an earthly sense and a cosmic sense. Deuteronomy 32 later in verse 43, I just wanted to throw this in, also has another reference to divine beings that the traditional text does not. So again, this helps as well to establish the correct reading of the Dead Sea Scrolls stuff, because in this one you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. You have 6 lines, and the pairings all parallel each other. But in this one you don't. There's something missing. You say, well, how did this wind up this way? Some of these sorts of things happen because the text that this is based on, the Masoretic text, was standardized at around 100 AD. And there are places where references to divine plurality are removed. And I don't want to get too far into this, but some of the motivating factors have to do with the divine plurality that extends from what happens with Christianity. there are some specific things that are changed in the Jewish text that's going to be transmitted down the road that are specifically aimed at undoing a theology that includes any sort of divine plurality. So, it just depends what book it is. But I don't want to get too far into that. The two powers stuff. Again, here's the parallelism again. We'll skip through that. Genesis 11, of course, is the incident that Deuteronomy 32 is referring to. Again, we have some plural language here. Let us go down. It's the same kind of thing that's going on in Genesis 1, 26. Here's the part we want to get to. So in Genesis 11, Babel, we have the disinheriting of the nations. Genesis 12, God calls Abram to create a new nation for himself, his portion it's referred to as. And the Old Testament story is Israel versus the nations. And if you count the number of nations in Genesis 10, I don't really recommend it. It's kind of a boring exercise. But there were 70. And that represents the number of nations that were known, the nations known to be in the world at the time of the writing. This is why you have this 70 thing going on. It shows up in other places too. It's going to come into play tomorrow when we look at Acts 2 and Pentecost, and how Pentecost is sort of the beginning of the reversal of this. But this idea of the known world at the time. And again, Yahweh versus the other gods. These are just examples of what's going on in terms of a sense of cosmic geography. This is one of my favorite stories. This is Naaman, the leper, with the dirt. I love that story. I guess I'll say something about it real quickly. This one, David is driven out of Judah, and he laments in this passage, like, how am I going to pray now that I'm, kicked out of, God's country and all this kind of stuff. It's not a denial that God is everywhere, but they had a sense that Canaan, the promised land, was holy ground. It was Yahweh's domain. And to be in right relationship with him, to commune with him as one ought, you needed to be in it. You need to be in sacred territory. Whereas if anywhere outside was impure, it was the domain of other deities, and I don't want to be there. Okay? This is kind of a good illustration because Naaman the leper comes from Syria. And we know the story. He goes and he has leprosy, and the little girl says, "Hey, go down and see, the prophet Elisha." And so he goes down. He gets mad because Elisha says, "Go jump in the Jordan and dip yourself 7 times, and it'll all be taken care of." And he's like, "What's the Jordan? I mean, good grief, it's a little creek. I got the Tigris and the Euphrates. I mean, what's that?" And he feels insulted. And then one of his soldiers says, "If he'd have told you to do something spectacular, would you have done it?" "Well, sure." "Well, why don't you try it? It's easy." So he does. He goes to the Jordan, dips himself 7 times, comes out, and he's clean. And he's so thrilled, he goes back to Elisha and tries to pay him something, out of gratitude. And he says no. And then the healed guy, Naaman, asks for what? Anybody remember? He asks for dirt. "Can I take some dirt back with me?" And he explains it. When I go in, I'm kind of responsible for the king. We got to go to the temple. And when we go to the temple, I kind of have to take him by the arm. And when we have to kneel down, I got to go down with him. And, would it be okay if I take some dirt back? Because either he's going to keep it with him, or he's going to sprinkle a little bit when nobody's looking, so that he's on holy ground. He believes, because he says right in the story, "I know now that Yahweh is he's the real God. He's the real deal. Can I take some dirt back?" And Elisha says, "Yeah, sure, go ahead. That'll work." Great idea. I wish everyone would ask that.
Why did he ask?
I think he had a sense that he needed connection with holy ground to worship the real God, the true God. He didn't want to be caught without it. Other cosmic geographical language, again, Daniel 10, princes, again, these are titles of rulership and authority. They're governing titles. And we see the references here in Daniel 10. prince of the kingdom of Persia, Greece. And then we have Michael, who is the prince in charge of Israel. And this is why there's a debate over how do we understand Michael. Is Michael the angel of the Lord? Who is Yahweh anyway? You know, is he Yahweh and some, you know, just calling him by another name and that sort of thing. There are other places where, again, he is described as, you know, one of the archangels. So he seems to be of lesser status than the angel of the Lord or Yahweh. But you can see why the discussion would happen, because this is Yahweh's domain. Israel is Yahweh's domain. Psalm 82 again, if you read through the whole psalm, and here's the council, down here again the reference to plurality, but the gods, you know, that were sons of the Most High are corrupt. They're doing a really bad job, and so God is going to judge them. And at the end of the psalm, we have this refrain: "Arise, O God, judge the earth. You shall inherit all the nations." Kick them out, get rid of them, and take them back. And eventually, in the New Testament, there are going to be key events where this process begins. There is a displacement of the beings who have authority over other pieces of geography now. So what we're going to see, on the one hand, again, this is sort of where we've been. We have, again, this Deuteronomy 32 worldview where there's Israel and the other nations under the auspices of other deities. Yahweh is still the global king because he's the one who does the doling out. He is the one who removes them when he deems it appropriate. Again, the idea is echoed in Daniel 10. It's really an eschatological judgment. It's the same idea that you've done wrong. You're going to die. He doesn't say you're going to drop dead now. He doesn't say you're dead. He says, because of your corruption, you are going to die. You are going to lose your immortality. And there are certain things in the New Testament that pick up on this and show us that their displacement has begun. And ultimately, it ends with the book of Revelation. New Testament uses certain terms to reinforce this idea, which we'll see. So what we're going to find out, especially tomorrow, is a lot of the reversals begin with the crucifixion and or the founding of the church. And even earlier than that, even when Jesus shows up and begins his ministry, you start to see some of these things. We're going to take a look at the connection of the announcement of the kingdom with driving out demons. Okay, it happens a lot in connection with the announcement that the kingdom of God is here. Leave. I mean, that's essentially what it is. You're no longer, just leave. But we'll see that tomorrow.